Hello guys and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing a video where I talk about how I draw bodies and how I use this technique to pose them. So what I'm doing first is I always start with a head. So the way that I do that is I just start with a circle and I'm just sketching it out. So the character I'm drawing is one that I've drawn a couple of times, and her name is Zyra, and she's a dancer, so I thought she would be the perfect candidate to show you how I do this because dancers usually show a lot of skin. They usually wear form-fitting clothes like leotards, so I thought this would, give me a good drawing in my sketchbook while also showing you guys how I do things. So here I'm just showing her head shape and adding her ears. She has more of an ovally head, so that's why I gave it to her, and then I'm just adding her ears. And looking now, they're lopsided, but it's okay. So when I start, this is just a standing up pose. So first, I usually draw the neck, and then I start with the shoulders. And since she's a younger character, I usually try to measure her shoulders to be around like the same width of her head. And from that line I bring it down and kind of draw a box shape, and that's supposed to represent her torso. Now I know her torso seems really short, and it's supposed to be just because she is a dancer and she has longer legs. And after I draw that box, I am drawing the little hip area, like the waist, and that's where like the legs go, and that's like where her hips are, and this gives me a guideline to see where her legs start. So when I draw her legs, I draw them in two sections. First, I draw her thighs, and her thighs are pretty thin, so they're just regular cylinders, thinking of everything in shapes. And sometimes I do just draw one whole line to represent how long I want the leg. Then I separate it into thighs, and then after that, I go and draw her calves. And so usually the line that's like from the outer edge of the thigh all the way down to the bottom of the calf is usually just one straight line because of how simplified my things are. But when I draw her calves, I do give her like a little bump to show a little bit of muscle. So here I'm drawing her ankles, which leads into her feet. I have a bad habit of drawing the feet as if they're already wearing shoes, but that kind of gives me the idea of like the arch in her foot and like just the shape of them. So that's how I draw her feet. And you're going to notice as I draw these characters, I usually do it from the torso all the way down to the legs, and then I add the arms, because when I think of the line of action for my characters, it usually starts from the torso all the way down to the legs, and the arms can literally do whatever and it wouldn't really affect it that much. So that's why I always do the arms pretty much last. So I start the arms by just showing one line, and this kind of shows me how long I want the arms. I have a tendency of drawing long arms, but I think it kind of fits the character just because she already has long legs and she has a short torso. So if I stopped her arms right by her hips, she would look really strange. So I also break the arm up into two sections. I break it up into, I think it's called the tricep, and then also the forearm. So basically the two sections are separated by the elbow, and I always give a little bump for the forearm too, just to show a difference so it's not like very noodly. And the hands, that's like a whole nother video, but I usually simplify them a lot. I either do the one on the left where it's pretty boxy, where I usually only distinguish the thumb and sometimes the index finger, and sometimes I draw the very like cupped hand that you see on the right. So I'm just trying to show a little bit of variety there. Now that I have her body mapped out, I have her head, her shoulders, her knees, her toes, her legs, her arms, everything. That is when I start going in with facial features and clothing. It's very hard for me to draw clothing without knowing what the body looks like underneath, and if you draw clothes before you know what the body looks like, you can get some really weird warping of things to make the clothes look better. So I usually just start with the body even if I know something big is going to go over it. So right now I'm just drawing her facial features. I almost always start with the eyes just because their placement everything else is dependent on them. And her eyes are just the best thing to draw for me. I love her giant bug eyes, they're just super cute. So next, I measure her hairline. So I draw a little semblance of a hairline and then I start with the part. I used to do the part with like one line and make it white, but I realized that looked a little strange. So I started making like the actual gap and I think it looks better. So I always do the facial features first and then I do the hairline. And right now I'm just finishing some more lines. When I draw in pen, it's very important for me to go over certain spots that I would if it was like line art. So the drawing just looks a little bit more cleaner and you know where your eyes are supposed to look. So right now I'm just finishing off the beginning of her hair and adding little details like earrings. I know how her hair usually looks like, so if it's like pulled back into two buns, one bun, a ponytail, whatever, I always draw like the hair before that because it doesn't really matter what the ponytail looks like. It's not going to interfere with like the top of her head slicked back. So here I'm a little unsure as to how I want her hair, so I just move on to adding her leotard. When drawing my dancers, it's actually very simple because leotards are so form-fitting that I just have to draw lines that differentiate the beginning and the end. And I usually give Zyra this very cute leotard that I want myself. It has a very high neck and no sleeves, and it cuts a little high around the legs. And it's just a very simple thing to do. And that's why I chose one of my dancer characters to show you guys how I draw bodies, just because it's easier to see their bodies and how I draw them, and their clothes don't really interfere with it because they're basically only really wearing a leotard and tights. And here I am again, just finishing some outlines to, you know, make the arms more prominent to show where you're supposed to look, and adding like the differences between the fingers. I made a mistake on the left because I usually leave out the index finger, like separate it from the whole blocky shape. I didn't do that this time. I don't know why, but you know, mistakes happen. And here I am again finalizing lines on the legs. So here I'm adding her toes, and I struggle a lot with drawing feet, so drawing them as shoes was probably not the best idea. But here I am. I kind of do the same thing how I do with my hands. With my hands, I almost always separate the thumb from everything else. And here's the same. I separate the big toe from everything else and sometimes leave the pinky out because there's usually not enough room for all 4 toes, so I usually like leave the pinky out on the side. And here I am just going to finish up her hair and just add 2 very iconic little buns on the side. And with that, I'm pretty much done with the framework of this drawing. The only other things I would add is color and hatching to her skin, and I'm gonna add the color now. The markers that I use, I say this in all the videos where I use them, I use the Tombow brush markers, and since they stay in my bag for a very long time, a lot of the labels have rubbed off, but I do know what packs they came from. Two of the markers that are used come from the pastel pack, the two blues, and then the more turquoisey dark blue comes from their tropical set. So yeah, and for the pen that I use, I just use a Bic soft feel pen, just something very regular. Alright, so here we are, and we're going to start using those building blocks that we just went over, and I'm going to use them to try to make a more interesting, more dynamic pose of her moving around and not just standing there. So since she's a dancer, I wanted to do a dance pose. So again, I'm starting with the head, and I decided to move it a little bit lower on the page and a little bit smaller because I knew for this pose I wanted her arm up, and her arm obviously goes past her head, so I needed a little bit of room for her hand and the forearm that's going to be going there. And as we said in the last process, I'm just drawing her head shape. Now I'm obviously drawing her neck to just kind of show how it would connect to her shoulders and just see how long it would be. And I want her torso, even though it's arched over, I want it to be facing front. So that's why I'm trying to make sure I try to keep the shoulders a little bit more even. And I'm also adding a little arch into the side of the rectangle shape that's supposed to represent her torso, because she is arching a little bit in the pose that I've selected. I think her torso looks a little long in this drawing, but it's okay because it's not like a super big difference. It's not like super off model, so I'm fine with it. And right now we can see the hips aren't very like facing forward. It's like one of her hips is up and they're not equal, but I will fix that later. So like I said before, I'm using one long line to represent one of the legs because it's just one continuous shape. And I'm using another line on the left to kind of show the general shape that I want for her other leg that's going to be in passe. And so this kind of shows me to see the length, like is one leg longer than the other? And if they are, how do I fix it? Is it a good length? Are they too long? Are they too short? Does it look right? And I decide so. So I'm going to move on to showing the arms. Again, the arms is one of the last things I position just because they usually don't mess with the line of action that I'm trying to do. So I just draw some really squiggly lines to show how long I want them to be and just show their placement just to see how everything looks before I finalize it. And here I am just going in fixing those hips and trying to make them more flat. Now, as I said, I'm breaking up the leg into two parts, the thigh and the calf. I'm also following that line that I made at the beginning to still get a more fluid line instead of making it so stiff. I feel like a lot of artists, when they first start and they do that method of like the ball of the joint and then the cylinder for the arm or the leg or the forearm or whatever, it can feel very stiff. So that's why instead of doing the ball for joints, I usually just draw one continuous line so I already have that flow, and then I add details of like the indent of the calf so it looks more realistic, but it's still more fluid than just like, you know, like ball stick, you know what I mean? And now I'm just drawing her releve, and I don't add in the toes. I'm just trying to get the basic form, because if I don't have the basic form, I'm probably not gonna have an alright looking foot. So now I'm gonna go in and finalize the left leg. I decided that I wanted that leg to be more so in front of the other one than behind. We kind of have an issue because I made this decision pretty last minute in my opinion. So now I have like this long line in the middle of her foot, which I tried to fix towards the end with the hatching, but it was just too bold. So, oh well, we live and we learn. It's just a sketch, it's in the sketchbook, it's done with pen. What do you expect? We can always do better next time. So I'm just finalizing it. The line that I used to show like the shape of it, I just use that as like the outer part of the leg, and then everything else I pretty much fill in, trying to make sure her legs aren't too thin, aren't too big, they're just proportional. And again, I'm going over lines to finalize them. And I can usually finalize lines a lot easier when I'm doing my dancer characters, because again, their clothes are very reliant on the shape of their body. So I can just go in and finalize the legs because I know I don't want anything on them. And once again, since I've finished all of the basic building blocks of the body, the head, the torso, the arms, the legs, the feet, and the hands, I'm moving on with facial details. And I don't really need to narrate this part because this is just how I draw. This isn't really like a tutorial on how to do my style. But yeah, so that's basically what I'm doing right now. I'm just adding facial features to her to make her look like a person. And I always recommend doing facial features and things last. Unless you're doing like a headshot, then it's perfectly fine to just, you know, do the head, the shoulders, and then just go right in, because obviously you don't have a body attached to it. But sometimes if you start with facial features first, you can get really caught up in that. And so when you try to add a body later, it just doesn't work because you're thinking more so on how her face looks rather than if this position is viable. So always be mindful. I usually try to finish the body first and then go back in with all the fun details, like how her eyes look, her mouth and clothes and things like that. So I'm pretty much done with like the drawing part of it, and now I'm just adding like color and details. So this is something I do a lot of the time with my sketches, especially with my pen sketches. When I have a dark skinned character, or usually like just a black character in general, I usually hatch their skin to give them the illusion of looking darker because they are darker. So I usually color everything else, but I usually do not like to have you know, blue skin. So I go in and I hatch the skin. So everything is pretty much colored in with like markers with color, except for the skin. I usually leave the skin either paper white or I hatch it with my pen. And when you're hatching, I recommend that you try to keep those lines lighter than the outlines that you did, because if they're just as dark, it's going to get very confusing and very like messy. So I don't recommend doing that. I don't always do this on my black characters or just my non-white characters, because sometimes the differentiation between the white paper and the pen isn't really needed. Like one of my characters, Trinity, she's pretty light skinned but she's still black, but I just don't hatch her in because I don't feel like it would add anything. I don't think it would say something, so I usually don't add it. And also when I'm hatching the skin, it hides a lot of those stray lines that I had. So you see how I have a like a straight line going like down the middle of her face, and if I just left her skin like the paper white, that would be very noticeable. But since I'm adding the hatching and there's so many vertical lines, you can't really tell. So that's also a little magic of hatching that I really appreciate, especially because I mostly draw in pen. And when I have like longer shapes, like her legs are very long, it's very hard to have a continuous straight line for that. So I usually break it up how I usually break up the legs. I'll do her thighs first and then I'll do her calves. So that is pretty much the end of this video. I hope this was helpful in any type of way, if it gave insight to how I draw, if it helped you create more fluid poses, whatever. I really hope it helped you. Thank you for watching my video, and I'll see you next time. Bye!